All right, today on The Explainer, we are diving into one of the biggest, most ambitious stories in the global climate fight right now, India's massive pivot to green energy. It's a story of huge targets, cutting-edge tech, but as we're about to see, it's also a whole lot more complicated than it seems on the surface.
So get this, by 2030, India has set this absolutely incredible goal, installing 500 gigawatts of renewable energy. Now, to give you some perspective on that number, that's more than the entire electricity capacity of Germany and the UK combined. Wow, this is a massive, world-leading commitment, and it's a huge signal that the country is ready to move away from fossil fuels. But, and this is a big but, behind that amazing number, there is a much trickier reality. This transition, as critical as it is, comes with some serious challenges. We're talking about hidden costs, and they're not measured in dollars, but in things like people's livelihoods and social fairness. And that really brings us to the core of this whole thing, what we're calling India's energy dilemma. See, the challenge is really coming from two sides. On one hand, how do you lift millions of people out of energy poverty and fuel a booming economy? And on the other, how do you do that while making this super fast switch to sustainable energy? It's a tough balancing act. And this chart, this really shows you the scale of what we're talking about. Right now, a whopping 80% of India's electricity comes from fossil fuels, mostly coal. And that's not just a statistic, right? It represents this deeply embedded economic and social system that makes this whole transition, well, incredibly difficult. Moving away from coal isn't as simple as just flipping a switch on a power plant. In a lot of places, coal is totally locked into the local economy. It's providing jobs, it's funding state governments, it's even paying for public services. So the real danger, the real risk, is that the burden of this whole shift could fall right on the shoulders of the most vulnerable people. Rural communities, women, marginalized groups who have the least power to make their voices heard. And this quote from the research really nails it. At the end of the day, this entire energy transition boils down to one simple, powerful question of fairness. Who benefits and how? Or, to put it even more simply, who wins and who loses?
So how in the world do you even start to unpack a problem this complicated? Well, thankfully, the research gives us a really powerful tool for this. A kind of lens, if you will, to see this transition not just as a technical issue, but as a deeply human one.
And that tool has a name. Energy justice. The best way to think about it is like a framework or a set of guidelines to make sure that as we're building this new energy system, we're sharing the costs and the benefits fairly. It's really all about making sure everyone has access, things are affordable, and people have a say in what happens.
Now, energy justice itself is built on three main ideas or tenets. And understanding these three is absolutely key to seeing how this whole thing plays out in the real world. So let's break them down one by one. Okay, first up is distributional justice. This one asks that really basic, fundamental question. Who wins and who loses? It's all about looking at how the good stuff, like new jobs and cleaner air, and the bad stuff, like, say, pollution or losing your land, how all of that is actually split up among different groups of people. Second, you've got procedural justice. And this one is all about the process of making decisions. So who actually gets a seat at the table? Are local communities being included when these huge projects are planned? Projects that are going to completely change their lives? Or are these critical decisions being made from the top down with no input? And finally, we have recognition justice. And you could argue this is the deepest, most fundamental pillar of the three. This one asks if the unique needs, the rights, and the cultural identities of all communities are being seen and respected, especially for those groups that have been pushed to the margins for, generations. Okay, so that's the framework: distributional, procedural, and recognition justice. Now, let's actually use this lens to see what's happening on the ground in India. We're going to look at two really powerful examples. One is absolutely massive, and the other is deeply personal. All right, first up, these huge utility-scale solar parks. I mean, these are the crown jewels of India's renewable dreams. We're talking about massive fields of solar panels stretching for miles and miles. Think of those giant parks in places like Gujarat and Karnataka, all designed to pump out gigawatts of clean power. But
here's the catch. The research warns that if you're not careful, these mega projects can turn into what's called a regime of accumulation. And what that means is it becomes a system where powerful groups get richer by taking away the very assets that local communities need to survive, like their land and their water. So what does that kind of injustice actually look like for people? Well, it means common grazing lands that pastoralists have used for centuries are suddenly gone, fenced off for a solar park. It means local farmers are completely shut out from any of the benefits of the project. And very often, it means women, who are usually the ones responsible for getting water and firewood, lose access to both. You can see right there, that's a clear failure of both distributional and recognition justice.
All right, for our second case study, let's zoom in way in, from the giant solar park down to the individual family kitchen, and talk about cooking fuel. Now, for a long time, the thinking here was based on something called the energy ladder. The basic idea is simple. As a family's income grows, they climb a ladder from polluting fuels like wood and dung up to cleaner ones like LPG gas or even electric stoves. But the research really pushes back on this and asks a super important question. Is it really that simple? Is switching to a clean cook stove really just about having more money in your pocket? Well, it turns out the answer is way more complicated and interesting than that. And this quote, this just reveals such a profound insight, especially when we think about recognition justice. What researchers found was that for many lower caste families, getting rid of the traditional smoky stove wasn't just about health benefits. It was a powerful social signal. It was an aspiration, a way to reposition themselves not just on the energy ladder, but on the social ladder too. So here, an energy choice is deeply, deeply tied to a person's identity and their place in society. So these examples really pull back the curtain on the deep-seated justice issues tangled up in India's energy transition, which, of course, leads to the big question: what can we actually do about it? Well, the research points towards a pretty clear path forward. The way forward seems to come down to three key things. First, policymakers have to put justice front and center. That means building clear goals like poverty reduction directly into the DNA of these energy projects, not just tacking it on as an afterthought. Second, we need to think bigger. We have to move beyond just looking at small case studies and start assessing the social impacts across the entire economy. And third, the rules need to be stronger. We need regulations with real teeth to make sure that even in these privatized energy markets, fairness and justice are non-negotiable. So really, when you boil it all down, the main takeaway is this. Yes, the technical challenge of switching to renewables is absolutely huge, but the social challenge is every bit as important. A transition that leaves the most vulnerable people behind, well, you really can't call that a success, can you? For this green revolution to truly work, it has to be a just revolution, too. And that leaves us with one final, and I think vital question. As the whole world races toward a greener future, we all have to ask ourselves, can any energy source really, truly be called clean if it isn't also just? Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.